After more than 5 years of full-scale fighting, is this finally the beginning of the end? As Volodymyr Zelensky challenges Vladimir Putin to meet face-to-face and talk about stopping the war. A day after Ukrainian drones struck an oil terminal and military sites around St. Petersburg, Zelensky has publicly offered Putin a deal, tying dramatic long-range strikes to a call for direct talks. Saying enough of the war, Zelensky throws down the gauntlet in an open letter, arguing that Ukraine, Russia, and Europe cannot keep living in a loop of endless casualties and shifting deadlines. From the St. Petersburg Forum, Putin says peace is still possible, but only on terms he calls the Anchorage Compromises, signaling that any deal must reflect understandings he claims to have reached with Donald Trump. Putin offers what he calls a way out of the war even as he boasts that Russian troops advance every day, trying to balance talk of compromise with a narrative of battlefield momentum. After 5 years of full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine, Zelensky has publicly invited Putin to sit down for direct face-to-face talks, arguing that only the two leaders can decide how this conflict ends. Zelensky's June 4 open letter was released just one day after Ukrainian long-range drones hit targets in St. Petersburg, turning a show of reach into a platform for political challenge. Those drones reportedly struck an oil terminal and nearby military-linked facilities in the Russian city, underlining that Ukraine can now bring the war deep into Russian territory. In his message, Zelensky argued that Europe cannot simply wait for global attention to swing back from Iran, insisting that the war in Ukraine needs its own urgent path to peace. The Ukrainian president said the time has come for direct engagement with Putin, rather than relying solely on intermediaries, shuttle diplomacy, or stalled multilateral formats. At the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Vladimir Putin said Russia is ready to end the war based on Anchorage terms, referring to understanding he claims were reached with Donald Trump in Alaska. Putin argued that any new agreement should follow the understandings he reached with Trump in Anchorage last year, calling them compromise proposals for both Russia and the United States. The Russian president boasted that his troops advance every day, saying that new settlements are regularly being brought under Russian control and highlighting thousands of square kilometers gained. Putin added that Ukraine wants Russia to halt its offensive, but said Moscow sees momentum on the battlefield and thus prefers to stop the war through compromises that reflect its territorial advances.
The proposals made by President Trump, I've already talked about this, can well be the basis of peaceful agreements. Therefore, answering your question, whether the administration acted in the right direction or not, yes, these are proposals that require compromise, and they are compromises of both countries, for Russia too. And we generally agreed with these compromises. We need to convince the Ukrainian side of this. But in general, I believe that they can well be the basis for an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, and they can put an end to this conflict. Everyone who thinks about this should ask themselves a question. Why? Why do we need this? It's clear about the conflict in Ukraine. The basis of the conflict is a coup in Ukraine and the suppression of everything Russian there. What does Europe have to do with it? What sense does it make for us to attack Europe and fight with NATO? I say it's nonsense, but I think it's not just nonsense. It's a deliberate provocation to create a threat that doesn't really exist, and to force the population of their countries to spend more money on defense. Everyone saw it, but almost no one talked about it. The reburial of Nazis and nationalists who destroyed Jews, Poles, and Russians in Ukraine during World War II. How many? I think 1 million Jews were destroyed in Ukraine, 1 million innocent people. And now in Ukraine, their remains were reburied with military honors and salute as heroes of Ukraine. Only Poland reacted weakly. Israel even more weakly. Everyone tries not to notice, shamefully not to notice. And who does this? The current head of the Kyiv regime, a Jew by nationality. His grandfather, who fought against Nazism, probably turned over in his grave. There, I think, it's written in the law they are going to write that Nazi propaganda is prohibited. But attention should be drawn to the Ukrainian authorities that it's not enough to write it in the law. It should be enforced. You understand the threat of the revival of Nazism. For everyone, not only does a weapon from Ukraine spread all over the world, it's already a fact. Not only does corruption flourish there, everything has grown. Corruption has taken deep roots. But Nazism is being revived. What to do with it later? These are facts. This just happened. A few days ago, one of the Nazis was reburied. It was his hands that destroyed Jews, Poles, Russians, and Gypsies, 1 million, with military honors, with a shot in the air, and silence follows. I understand that some countries want to use everything to fight Russia, but this is a threat to everyone. They should think about it. As for Russia's attack on Europe, it's certainly nonsense. But not only, it's also a provocation and disinformation to fool their own population to extract money for fighting against Russia, for demilitarizing their economies. To start negotiations, there is no need to stop hostilities. And we had negotiations, and hostilities did not stop. Russian troops advance every day, and every day, if you follow the reports of ongoing events closely, you will hear that new settlements are being brought under control of the Russian armed forces. Recently, I repeat, almost 2,500 square kilometers have come under the control of the Russian army. 2,440 square kilometers. Naturally, under these conditions, the Ukrainian side would like us to stop the advancement of Russian troops. In the Zaporizhia region, there is daily advancement by kilometers, 1,200, 1,300, 800 meters along the front, the same in depth. Of course, they want to stop this. But it's better not to stop this, but to stop the war as a whole through the compromises discussed in Anchorage. Under the Ukrainian constitution, the president is limited to 2 5-year terms. If we agree with those who believe that President Zelensky extended his term legally, then 2 years have already passed. So is he now going to run for another 5 years? That is not permitted under the Constitution. Only 2 5-year terms, or 10 years in total. But what about the 2 years he has already spent in power? There are many questions. But if we do eventually get to signing the documents, I think that if there is a desire to end the armed conflict peacefully, and Russia does have such a desire, we will find those who need to sign the relevant document. Where there's a will, it's a very important matter, but it is, after all, a legal issue. With regard to what we might say to one another when the conflict comes to an end, the very least we should say is, thank God it's all over. But the legal side to the matter must, naturally, be looked into at the specialist level. I think this is understandable.
Russia's foreign minister has also claimed that Moscow remains ready for negotiations, repeating that the Kremlin is always ready to talk about ending the conflict. However, Sergei Lavrov insisted the real problem is a lack of readiness on Ukraine's side, arguing that Kyiv is non-negotiable and backed by Western supporters who only want Russia weakened.
We are ready. As President Putin has repeatedly said, we are always ready to talk. However, we do not see a willingness on the other side and, most importantly, we do not see partners with whom it is possible to negotiate. As for the Ukrainians, the regime that came to power after the coup in February 2014 is absolutely non-negotiable, and I think this no longer needs to be proven to anyone. Those who support it, who provide financing and supply weapons, know perfectly well the nature of this regime. And with such, I would say, ferocious zeal, the Europeans defend Zelensky solely because he is fighting against the Russian Federation on behalf of European and, more broadly, Western interests, serving the West's idea of suppressing Russia as a competitor. At the same time, I do not want to quote her word for word, but she is still the head of the EU's foreign policy structure, Kaja Kallas, and she declares, "We demand that Russia sit at the negotiating table. But first it must reduce its army and reduce its weapons, set some kind of limits." And then she openly states, as many other European representatives have done, that Europe will not be a mediator at the negotiating table. So what will Europe be then? Someone who dictates conditions and accepts an act of Russia's capitulation? Europe has deceived both Russia and the rest of the world repeatedly. The West is non-negotiable, acting on the principle, here I make promises, then I drag things out until either the donkey dies, as one of our Arabic proverbs suggests. This line is, I would say, quite dishonest, aimed at unilateral gain, to receive, accumulate, demand concessions, and so on. Unfortunately, this approach now dominates. Europe, for me, in its current state, under the leadership of these elites, is a cut-off slice for world diplomacy. There are voices saying, we will have to talk someday. All of this is unserious. They had a huge number of chances, and they squandered all of them. Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, went to Kyiv and said outright that Ukraine would be in NATO. He did not care that the United States, represented by President Trump, considers this unacceptable. And Rutte simply declared, while embracing Zelensky, that Ukraine would be in NATO. As for the recognition of the territories, the situation that has developed as a result of the struggle by the population of southeastern Ukraine against the Kyiv regime, it has been publicly stated by Zelensky, and Europe supports him, that there will be no recognition. They say, we will stop the war, accumulate forces, and then we will take these lands back, so that the Nazi regime remains on these lands, or rather, that a Nazi regime is restored there. The fact that Europe, in addition to dragging Ukraine into NATO, finds it easier to admit it into NATO than to take the fatal step of including Ukraine in the European Union. They understand perfectly well that the EU would then collapse. It was very strange that after we agreed to the US proposal in Anchorage, they began to change their position and, instead of promoting those very proposals in their relations with the Ukrainians, they are now pretending that the parties involved should sort things out among themselves. This is not very logical. Thus, speaking in Congress, in addition to saying that Russia is in no way ready for concessions, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the United States is not a mediator because it consistently supports Ukraine, continuing to supply weapons and military equipment in the same volumes as before. It is not only the dialogue itself that is important, although it is important, but also the implementation of what has been agreed upon. I want to repeat, we reached a very clear understanding in Alaska based on a specific proposal from the United States. And if the United States had truly promoted its own initiative, I think we would have been at the negotiating table long ago, and military actions would have been halted.
At the White House, Donald Trump welcomed the idea of a Putin-Zelensky summit, signaling that Washington would support a direct leaders meeting if it leads to a real path out of the war. The US president said it would be great if both leaders sat down to end the conflict, casting himself as ready to back a deal that stops the fighting, even as he pushes his own Anchorage framework in parallel.
Yes, President Trump, this was just crossing as we were heading in here. President Zelensky wrote a letter to President Putin. He wants the two of them to meet to hash out the end of the war in Ukraine because he thinks you are too busy with the war in Iran. Is he right?
Well, I don't know. I'm glad that they're maybe talking about meeting. I think we had a lot to do with it. I know exactly what you're doing. But I think it would be great if they met. They should get it done.
President Putin said today that he was willing to make compromises that you requested to end the war with Ukraine if Ukraine was willing to make similar compromises.
Yeah.
What were the compromises that you asked
Well,
Putin
I'd
to make?
rather not say because Peter asked me. I think it was meant as a little wise guy question, but I'm not sure. But I'm very responsible when that happens. It's going to happen. They're going to both make compromises. I suggested those compromises. And, you know, we've had a lot to do with it. We'd love to see their two very good people. They're two very, incredible countries, beautiful countries. They got us up. Last month they had 25,000 people killed. Soldiers, mostly soldiers. Some people, but mostly soldiers. And it's been averaging probably almost 25,000 people every month of soldiers killed. And I've been very strong on the fact that they've got to get that over with. So, but they do. I want them each to make certain compromises. I think they're going to do that.
China is funding an anti-data center movement here in the
No,
U.S.
I'm not worried about it. We had a great meeting with China. And, you know, they do things to us and we do things to them. I say it all the time. They say, are you worried about China tapping your phones? I said, well, you know, they're worried about the same thing. No, we're very highly sophisticated. We've become very highly sophisticated. We had 4 years. I rebuilt the military. We had a military that was not good, and we rebuilt it. And I didn't know I'd use it quite as much, but we used it. Ukraine has been given a tremendous amount of our without our military and our equipment. Ukraine wouldn't be alive to fight today. You know, just in terms of the question, we gave them hundreds of billions of dollars worth of equipment. And the best equipment. We make the best equipment anywhere in the world, but they wouldn't have lasted 1 or 2 days. They wouldn't have been able to do it. Remember the anti-tank missiles? Remember that, right? When the tanks got stuck in the mud, and then they went around and boom, 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 and those were given by yours truly. They said Obama gave sheets and Trump gave. The anti-tank as one of the most devastating weapons But you check that out. But we have the greatest military. We have the greatest military equipment anybody's ever seen before.